On Formal Logic and Dialectical Logic, B.I. Lazowski. From the magazine Problems of Philosophy, 1951, 4th issue. The essential condition for solving the question of the relation between dialectical and formal logic is the correct evaluation of the constituent parts of the latter. The laws of identity, contradiction, the excluded third, sufficient reason, and the doctrine of the forms of thought. Although no one in our literature now advocates the view that the laws of formal logic contradict the laws of dialectics, nevertheless this view cannot be regarded as definitively overcome, as long as the question remains unresolved as to how these laws agree with each other. Of the two directions emerging in the solution of this question, one is based on the fact that the question can be solved only by considering the basic laws of formal logic as elementary laws of thought, which are not laws of conceivable things. To the supporters of this direction, it seems that by depriving the elementary laws of thought of their subject character, they resolve the question of the relation between formal logic and dialectics by referring the formological laws and the laws of dialectics to two different domains, destroying the contradictions between them. It is quite obvious that such a separation of thinking from being contradicts the very spirit of the Leninist theory of reflection and must be decisively rejected. Another direction proceeds from the fact that the formological laws of thinking are at the same time the laws of conceivable things and phenomena, but such laws of things and phenomena which operate only in the sphere of their simplest relations. The understanding of the laws of formal logic as laws of the simplest relations of things and phenomena, being correct in itself, turns out to be insufficient, because even within this understanding different interpretations of the question of the relation between the laws of dialectics and formal logic are possible, up to the absolutization of the latter and the recognition of a special sphere in which their domination is undivided and the action of the laws of dialectics is excluded. This is how Professor Strogovich interprets this question in his book Logic. In the sphere of the simplest relations of things and phenomena, the laws of formal logic operate in full force, and they are sufficient for the cognition of the corresponding objects. Thus, the domain assigned to formal logic appears to be sovereign and not permitting dialectical interference. As for dialectical logic, it is not guaranteed sovereign rights at all. The laws of formal logic, writes Professor Strogovich, which represent the necessary conditions of human thought, retain their force for dialectical thinking. It turns out that the laws of dialectics are not the most general laws of nature, society, and thinking, for there is an area, the simplest relations of objects and phenomena, where the laws of formal logic are fully effective and sufficient. On the contrary, the laws of formal logic are given a universal character, because they are recognized as valid in both spheres, both the simplest and the most complex relations. It is obvious, therefore, that the mere understanding of the laws of formal logic as laws of the simplest relations of things and phenomena does not ensure their correct Marxist evaluation. It is also insufficient because, being too general, it does not indicate the limits of the area in which the laws of formal logic operate. In order to give a correct assessment of the meaning of the laws of formal logic, it is necessary to reveal the nature of the relations which these laws express. In their true meaning, not perverted by metaphysical interpretation, these laws express the relations between the belonging of a known property of a thing and the belonging of the thing itself to a class. The law of identity expresses this relation in the following way. The belonging of a thing to a certain property testifies to the belonging of this thing to a class. The absence of this property excludes its belonging to this class. From the fact that things are divided into classes according to their external properties, it does not follow at all that immobility is inherent in them. Metaphysics consists not in asserting that things are divided into classes by their external properties, but in asserting that the properties of things, and consequently the classes into which they are divided, are eternal and unchangeable. The law of identity says nothing about either the permanence or the changeability of the properties of things and classes. Equally little does the law of contradiction say anything about the consistency of things and phenomena. The law of contradiction expresses the same relation as the law of identity, but in a negative form. The belonging of a known property of a thing cannot but mean the belonging of the thing itself to a class, and the belonging of a thing to a class cannot but mean the belonging of a known property to it. The law of contradiction contains only the statement that a thing cannot have and at the same time not have a given property, hence belong and not belong to a given class. The statement that according to the law of contradiction a thing cannot have opposite and contradictory properties is its metaphysical perversion. The law of contradiction does not forbid the assertion that something, being positive, is also negative, that truth is absolute and relative at the same time, but it forbids the assertion that the absolute is devoid of absolute content, that the relative is irrelevant, etc. Nor does the dialectic allow such contradictions. The appropriation which does not appropriate, Marx writes, is contradictio in subjecto, and therefore Marx rejects it as untrue. Thus, in their true meaning, the laws of formal logic do not contradict the laws of dialectics and are laws not only of thought, but also of thought things and phenomena, expressing the relation of belonging of a property to a thing and of a thing to a class. This character of the laws of formal logic appears most clearly in the formological doctrine of inference. The axiom of syllogism directly expresses the content of the laws of formal logic. Everything that is affirmed or denied with respect to a class of objects is also affirmed or denied with respect to any individual object belonging to this class. But the relations of belonging are the most external relations of things and phenomena, which recede into the background as soon as we pass from the consideration of the external properties of objects and phenomena to the cognition of their inner essence. In the sphere of the inner essence of things and phenomena, the dominant relations are those of cause and effect, individual and species, kind and genus. Things and phenomena appear to belong to classes only by their external and accidental properties. By their inner nature they belong to species and genus. The laws of formal logic, as expressing the relations of belonging, are laws of external relations of things and phenomena, and by this character of them the sphere of their action as the sphere of external relations of things and phenomena is completely determined. The boundaries of this sphere are defined with utmost clarity by V.I. Lenin in his work Once More About Trade Unions. Perhaps in a rare book or article on questions of logic the following passage from this brilliant work of Lenin is not quoted. Formal logic, which is restricted in schools, and must be restricted, with amendments, for the lower grades of school, takes formal definitions, guided by what is most usual or what most often catches the eye, and limits itself to this. But, strangely enough, in these words of Lenin one does not see the only truly scientific definition of the subject of formal logic as the science of the laws of external relations of things and phenomena. What do Lenin's words that formal logic takes formal definitions mean? What, in fact, are formal definitions? Formal definitions are definitions that do not express the inner content, the inner essence of things and phenomena and refer only to their external form. In other words, formal definitions mean external definitions, definitions of a thing through its external properties, which do not express its inner essence. Dealing only with such formal definitions, i.e. definitions that do not express the essence of things, formal logic can be nothing else but the logic of the external relations of things and phenomena. Further, what is meant by Lenin's words that formal logic is guided by what is most usual or what most often catches one's eye? These words again mean that formal logic is the logic of the external relations of things and phenomena. For what is most usual and most often conspicuous is again external. The inner essence of things and phenomena is not only not conspicuous, but is generally inaccessible to mere contemplation. Finally, is it necessary to prove the meaning of the concluding words of the above quotation, and is limited to this, as words strictly defining the scope of applicability of the laws of formal logic, limiting it to the usual, most often conspicuous, i.e. external relations of things and phenomena? At first glance, the difference between defining the laws of formal logic as laws of the simplest relations of things and phenomena and defining them as laws of external relations of things and phenomena may seem unimportant and of no fundamental importance, since external relations appear to be identical with the simplest ones. However, although external relations are the simplest, some essential internal relations, i.e. relations of content, may be recognized as simple and even the simplest. In the sense of Lenin's words, formal logic is therefore formal because it takes the external, which does not express content, and limits itself to this. From the definition of the laws of formal logic as laws of the simplest relations of things and phenomena, it follows that formal logic relates to dialectical logic as the logic of the simplest relations to the logic of the complex relations of reality. But such an understanding of the relation between the two logics is extremely uncertain and acquires a different meaning depending on which relations are recognized as simple and which as complex. From the definition of the laws of formal logic as the laws of external relations of things and phenomena follows a completely definite understanding of the correlation between formal and dialectical logic, which has only one meaning, namely, formal logic relates to dialectical logic as the logic of phenomena relates to the logic of essence. A correct understanding of the nature of formal logic as a science of forms of thought is as necessary a condition for solving the problem of the relation between dialectical and formal logic as is a correct understanding of the nature of the laws underlying the latter. Almost the main reason for the failure of all, though few, attempts to solve the question of the relation between dialectical and formal logic is the common misconception in our literature, which consists in the unconditional and unrestricted recognition of formal logic as the only science of forms of thought. So far, the view of formal logic as the only science of forms of thinking with the consequent denial of dialectical logic as a science of forms of thinking has been openly expressed only by Professor Bacrades in his article on the question of the correlation of logic and dialectics. But justice demands to say that Professor Bacrades only openly formulated what was already contained in a hidden form in the definitions of formal logic by Professor Asmus and S.N. Vinogradov and in Professor Strogovich's understanding of it. Professor Bacrades only brought to its logical conclusion the view of formal logic as the only science of the forms of thought in general and made a fruitless attempt to justify it. The character of formal logic as a science of the forms of thought is entirely determined by the character of the laws underlying it. As we have endeavored to show, the laws underlying formal logic are the laws of the external relations of things and phenomena, and, in the closest way, the laws of the relations of belonging of a property to a thing and of a thing to a class. But if this is true, then it is also true that, by the nature of the laws underlying it, formal logic is the science of the classifying activity of thinking. The classifying activity of thinking, or classification, is quite often confused with the systematizing activity of thinking, or systematization. Such mixing of two different types of thinking activity is a gross mistake, because systematization is always associated with the analysis of the inner nature of things and phenomena, based on the establishment of known regularity. Its result is always a more or less coherent whole, system. In contrast, classification is associated with the analysis of only external properties of things and phenomena, and its result never appears as a coherent whole. Since classification is inseparably connected with the analysis of the external sides of things and phenomena, formal logic, being the logic of classification, is to the same extent the logic of analyzing the external sides of things and phenomena. Its main way of cognition consists in singling out by means of analysis from the totality of sensually perceived properties of an object this or that separate property and assigning the object to a class, as well as in establishing on the basis of the belonging of the object to the class the belonging of this or that property to it, if this belonging cannot be established directly. As a logic of analysis and classification, formal logic cannot be a science of forms of thinking in general, hence not the only science of forms of thinking. It does not and cannot set the task of research and cognition of their inner nature. Formal logic only describes, enumerates, and compares forms of thinking on the basis of external features. The position that formal logic does not investigate the inner nature of various forms of thinking, but only lists and describes them, is repeatedly emphasized by Engels. On the contrary, dialectical thinking, Engels writes, has as its prerequisite the investigation of the nature of concepts themselves. A characteristic feature of formal logic, as Engels notes, is that formal logic, based on the four laws of thought, merely enumerates and compares different forms of thought. This feature follows from the very essence of its tasks, from its recognition as the logic of analysis and classification. Analysis and classification, being only ways of preparing scientific cognition, cannot reveal the inner nature of the studied subject. Cognition begins not with the inner nature of the subject, but with its external properties, which are first of all subjected to analysis. The results of the analysis are consolidated by classification. In no field of cognition with the help of formal logic can one achieve greater results than the dissection of the external sides of the studied objects and their classification. Especially in its own field it cannot be required to do more, for an attempt to achieve any significant results in the field of abstract thinking by means of the methods of analysis and classification alone is even more hopeless. A mere description, enumeration, and comparison of forms of thinking on the basis of external features, which is, in fact, the task of formal logic, naturally cannot give a full and any exhaustive knowledge of the forms of thinking, cannot reveal their inner nature. Based on the four laws of thinking, formal logic is the science of the classifying activity of thinking. Since the classifying activity of thinking is carried out not in special forms of thinking, but in the same forms in which all its activity takes place, i.e. in various kinds of judgments and inferences, then, and only then, formal logic is engaged in their study. Since the classifying activity of thinking is only one side of thinking, and not the main one, since the higher types of thinking activity take place in the same forms, the formological doctrine of the forms of thinking is insufficient. The definition of formal logic as a science of the forms of thinking is acceptable only with an essential reservation indicating that the forms of thinking are its subject not entirely and not from the side of their inner nature, but only from the side in which the classifying activity of thinking takes place in them. To assert that formal logic is a science of the forms of thought without this important reservation is to exaggerate the importance of classification to the point of absoluteness, which inevitably leads to idealism. Only dialectical logic can be a science of the forms of thought, revealing their inner nature and organic connection. Dialectical logic studies the relations between concepts, judgments, and inferences in terms of content, as relations of individual, species, and genus, including the positive content of formal logic and being its highest stage. Thus, formal logic turns out to be a part of dialectical logic, preserving its rational content within a deeper dialectical understanding of the forms and laws of thought.